Following the Allied breakout from Normandy in July 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's armored spearheads sped toward their objectives, giving the Germans no time to regroup. By Robert L. Durham. German Panzer Grenadiers surrounded Hill 314 just east of Mortain in Normandy on August 7, 1944, trapping several companies of the 2nd Battalion of the U.S. 120th Infantry Regiment. Over the course of the next 5 days, as the Germans rained mortar shells and pounded their positions with direct fire from their deadly 88mm guns, the tenacious Americans held on. Each time elements of the German 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division attempted to storm the rocky heights, the encircled Americans called in artillery fire to hold them off. At one point, the opposing sides were so close that an American officer called down artillery fire on his command post. Throughout the ordeal, the American soldiers trapped on the hill searched the bodies of their dead for food and ammunition before placing them in a makeshift morgue among the rocks. Various attempts were made to resupply them. U.S. artillery units even tried to fire shells filled with supplies to the hilltop, but the effort was an abysmal failure because the contents were either crushed or scattered over the hilltop. Supplies were also dropped from C-47s, but the parachutes often drifted into no man's land. After 5 days of bitter fighting, the Germans called it quits on August 12th. Of the 670 officers and enlisted men defending the hill, the Americans lost 300. 7 weeks after the D-Day landing, the Allies still had not pierced the German defensive line in Lower Normandy. The situation deeply frustrated the Allied senior leadership. At a heavy cost in lives, Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey's British Second Army had taken on July 9th and Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army captured St. Lo on July 18th. The Wehrmacht leadership in Berlin, however, made a costly strategic error in holding the German 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais in anticipation of a second Allied landing in that sector. As a result, powerful reserves that might have strengthened SS Generaloberst Paul Hauser's hard-pressed German 7th Army in Normandy remained unavailable. Hello, history enthusiasts and fellow seekers of truth. Today, we're not just recounting battles, we're descending into the crucible of courage, into a chapter of World War II so pivotal, so fraught with peril, that it defies imagination. We're going back to Normandy, to the blistering summer of 1944, a time when the very fate of Europe hung in the balance. This is the story of a desperate stand, a strategic miscalculation, and the relentless drive that ultimately shattered the Axis war machine. Prepare yourselves, because the tale you're about to hear is a testament to unwavering bravery, the human cost of war, and the ingenuity that turns the tide of history. Imagine the scene, July 1944. Weeks after the monumental D-Day landings, the Allied forces were finally, powerfully, breaking free from the hedgerow country of Normandy. The initial, brutal deadlock was over. And at the forefront of this unstoppable surge was a man whose name still echoes with legendary force, Lieutenant General George S. Patton. His armored spearheads, like lightning bolts, sliced through the fractured German lines, speeding toward their objectives with an audacious aggression that gave the enemy no time to regroup, no chance to breathe. This wasn't just an advance. It was a flood, a torrent of Allied might pouring into the heart of occupied France. But even in the midst of this grand offensive, individual battles, struggles of unimaginable ferocity, were raging. Small pockets of resistance, desperate stands, define the landscape. Our story now narrows, focusing on one such crucible of heroism. Picture a nondescript rise of ground, just east of Mortain, known simply as Hill 314. On August 7, 1944, this rocky outcrop became a living hell. German panzer grenadiers, the elite of the SS, surrounded it, trapping several companies of the U.S. 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment. For these American soldiers, the world had suddenly shrunk to the confines of that hill, a tiny island of defiance in a sea of overwhelming enemy forces. Over the course of the next 5 agonizing days, these tenacious Americans held on, defying the odds, defying death itself. The Germans rained mortar shells upon their positions, a constant, concussive barrage. Their deadly 88mm guns, feared across every front, pounded the heights with direct fire, each explosion ripping through the air, shaking the very earth beneath their feet. Every minute was a test of endurance, every second a gamble with fate. Surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, the men of the 120th dug in, transforming that barren hill into an impenetrable fortress of will. Each time elements of the German 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, elite and ruthless, attempted to storm the rocky heights, the encircled Americans had one desperate, yet incredibly effective answer: artillery. They called in fire, a deafening symphony of destruction that smashed into the advancing enemy. So close were the opposing sides, so desperate the situation, that at one terrifying point, an American officer called down artillery fired directly on his own command post. Think about that for a moment. Choosing to risk friendly fire, to face the very real possibility of annihilation from their own guns, rather than let the enemy overrun their position. Such was the desperation, such was the courage. Throughout this unimaginable ordeal, the American soldiers trapped on that hill faced not only the enemy's relentless attacks, but also the insidious creep of hunger and the dwindling supply of ammunition. They searched the bodies of their fallen comrades, a grim, heartbreaking task, for sustenance and precious bullets. Before reverently placing them in a makeshift morgue among the rocks, a testament to their unwavering respect for the dead. Their fight for survival was not just against the Germans. It was against exhaustion, against starvation, against the very elements themselves. Various desperate attempts were made to resupply these brave men. U.S. artillery units, in an audacious but ultimately futile effort, even tried to fire shells filled with supplies to the hilltop. But the effort was an abysmal failure. The contents were either crushed into uselessness or scattered over the hilltop, just out of reach. Supplies were also dropped from C-47 transport planes, those workhorses of the air. But the winds of Normandy were fickle, and the parachutes often drifted into no man's land, tantalizingly close, yet tragically inaccessible. Hope, repeatedly, was snatched away. 4-5 harrowing days, the battle for Hill 314 raged. 5 days of bitter, bloody fighting. And then, on August 12th, the impossible happened. The Germans, battered and broken by the Americans' unyielding resolve, finally called it quits. They withdrew. Of the 670 officers and enlisted men who had bravely defended that tiny hill, the Americans lost 300. A staggering cost, a devastating loss of life. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Hill 314 held. It became a symbol of American tenacity, a testament to what men could endure and achieve when pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. Now let's zoom out from this intense battlefield and consider the larger strategic picture, for it reveals an astonishing truth about the Axis collapse. 7 weeks after the D-Day landing, despite the courage shown on Hill 314, the Allies still had not pierced the German defensive line in lower Normandy. The frustration among Allied senior leadership was palpable. Heavy casualties had been incurred. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey's British Second Army had taken Cannes on July 9th, and Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army captured St. Lo on July 18th. Hard-won victories, yes, but the breakthrough, the decisive rupture, was proving stubbornly elusive. The Allied generals, particularly Bradley, were chafing under the slow pace, knowing that every day of delay allowed the Germans to dig in deeper, to inflict more casualties. The cost in lives was immense, and the strategic imperative was clear. They had to break out. But fate, or perhaps a colossal misjudgment, was about to intervene on the Allied side. The Wehrmacht leadership in Berlin, under the direct, often erratic, influence of Hitler himself, made a costly strategic error that would reverberate across the entire Western Front. In anticipation of a second, larger Allied landing, the German High Command held back the powerful German 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais. They were convinced, absolutely certain, that the Normandy invasion was a mere feint, a diversion for the real attack that would come across the narrowest part of the English Channel. This was a direct result of ingenious Allied deception tactics, brilliantly fooling the German intelligence. As a result of this catastrophic misjudgment, powerful German reserves, hundreds of thousands of crack troops, tanks, and artillery that might have turned the tide against SS Generaloberst Paul Hauser's hard-pressed German 7th Army in Normandy remained unavailable. This, dear friends, was the turning point. This strategic blunder born of paranoia and brilliant Allied deception meant that the German forces fighting in Normandy were starved of reinforcements, stretched to their breaking point, and ultimately doomed. The sacrifice on Hill 314, the hard-won gains at Caen and St. Lo, they were all part of a larger, unfolding catastrophe for the Axis. The collapse was not merely tactical. It was strategic, born from a fatal error in judgment that prevented Germany from reinforcing its collapsing front. The Allied breakout, spearheaded by Patton's relentless advance, combined with Germany's fatal strategic miscalculation at Pas-de-Calais, created a perfect storm. The Axis forces in Normandy, already reeling, were now facing an overwhelming tide with no hope of substantial reinforcements. Their lines fractured, their morale plummeted, and the collapse became inevitable. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a rout, a desperate scramble as the German war machine in the West began to unravel. The Axis collapse in Normandy in August 1944 was a complex tapestry woven with threads of unimaginable courage, brilliant Allied strategy, and devastating German misjudgment. It's a powerful reminder that even the strongest empires can crumble when faced with unwavering determination and a crucial error of foresight. The bravery of those men on Hill 314, the audacity of Patton's advance, and the unseen hand of strategic deception all converge to shape the destiny of a continent. What do you find most astonishing about this pivotal moment in World War II? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. If this journey into history moved you, please give this video a like, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage and conflict, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Until next time, keep learning and keep remembering.